Well, any recitation of my life before EPA will make it clear there's no straight shot between what you do ahead of time and EPA. I was, after being educated as a lawyer, I went back and practiced law in the city of Indianapolis, where I was from, with my father and my brother. I was also part of the Indiana Attorney General's office at the time, and I became active in the Republican Party, as was my father, and brother was in the state senate at the time. I ran for Congress in 1964 and then ran for the Indiana House of Representatives in 1966. I only served there one time and was majority leader, and after that ran for the Senate in Indiana, and I was nominated. You were then nominated by convention. And after that came to the after finishing second in that effort at the statewide level, Birch Bayh was the incumbent, and it was very hard for a non-incumbent and someone like me to beat. So I went into the Justice Department and was Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Division. And from there was asked by the President to be the first administrator of EPA in 1970.
Well, I had been in government for many years at a state level in South Carolina, and then came to Washington, and actually was the deputy director of FEMA. I had been in public safety work for years, and that's how I happened to be in Washington, and was asked to go to EPA on a detail for 90 days during a time when the agency really was in crisis, and a group of 4 people were asked to go over as a management team to help get the agency back on track. I ended up staying there 6 years. So I would say my path was one of government service, certainly not environmental service, and I was asked to go to EPA basically as a senior management assistant in government.
Well, it starts growing up on a farm, which is what I did, and spending a lot of time outdoors with my family, doing any kind of sports we could do, whether it was mountain biking or horseback riding or hiking or fishing, whatever. It puts you more in tune with nature than living in a city, perhaps, and also in New Jersey, which is the most densely populated state in the nation. You saw the result of all the pressure for development on land and what it was doing to the air, quality of air, what it was doing to water, what it was doing to land. And then as governor, I had a lot of focus on the environment, and in fact we did a great deal to clean up our beaches. We got them so the EPA actually gave us an award for having the best beach monitoring program in the country. We got a bond issue through to preserve 1 million acres of open space and farmland in the state, which when it's finished will mean that the state will have preserved voluntarily 40% of its land mass. We were able to reduce industrial pollution by over 58% during those years and still see the economy grow. So that whole mix that says this is not an either-or issue, this is one where you can have a clean and green environment and a healthy and thriving economy, was something that was very important to me, and how we measured environmental success was very important. So I think all those things together, when it came time for the president, he was looking around, he figured he needed somebody from the Northeast, I guess, and I had a good enough record there that it made some sense to him.
It really came from the Attorney General, who was then John Mitchell, and he was quite close to the President. They had been law partners before the President ran for office in 1968, and Mitchell was then appointed Attorney General, and he was the one who asked me if I would consider that job. I had been mentioned earlier in a Newsweek article, and I found out how that happened, and Jerry Hansler, who was afterwards the regional administrator in New York and had been active in Indiana when I was there as an assignee from the National Health Service, had mentioned my name to a reporter, and it appeared in Newsweek. And being then a part of the Justice Department, I went up and talked to the Attorney General and said, look, I didn't plant this. I'm not trying to get another job. And I told him how it happened. And that was really how my name got into the mix. And out of that mist that names somehow get chosen for jobs like this, my name emerged, and the Attorney General asked me if I was really interested in it.
Actually, it wasn't so much the phone call, because it was Vice President who called, actually, and the couple of times I spoke was when I came down here to have the interview with the President, and we had also just arrange the transfer of Barney. Barney was the puppy that we bred, and the president gave to Laura. He came up to New Jersey for an event right before the election, and it was Laura's birthday, and he didn't have a gift for her because the gift he'd had, for some reason, the chief of staff said she wouldn't like, so it got sent back. So he had nothing, and I said, well, we happen to have puppies, and they'd be really great, and they'd said yes. And then, of course, once he won the election, and we had that long time in Florida, a long time before it was certified, and it was sort of back and forth. Could they really take a puppy going to the White House? What was happening? And finally decided they could. So that day when I went down to meet with him, Barney was delivered, and he was delivered to Laura, and she brought him in while I was sitting there with the president. He came rushing in and did a big pee right in the middle of the rug in the hotel. So that was a good way to start.
Well, I should have been scared, but I didn't know what I was doing. It was a very complex management problem because we had 15 agencies and pieces of agencies that were put under one umbrella, and we had to make them all work. And those, for instance, we had a pesticide office that was located in the Agriculture Department, and a pesticide office that was in the Department of Health and Education, Welfare, that were put under one roof. Those two groups fought each other in the existing administration. One was created to promote the use of pesticides, and another was created to regulate them. And that's a prescription for a pitched battle. And so we had to put all those pieces together and make them work. And it was a very complex management. I had experience managing. I was a deputy attorney general in the Attorney General's office in Indiana, and had managed some 83 lawyers, but that really had been the extent of my management experience. It was quite, from that standpoint, quite a challenge. And as I said, if I really knew how much of a challenge it was, I might not have accepted.
You know, it was a very difficult time. The agency had gone through and went through quite a bit of trauma. We had to go through a major change as far as the senior leadership is concerned. Bill Ruckelshaus came back in as administrator for the second time. He asked me to stay as an assistant administrator in the Office of Solid Waste Emergency Response. He basically changed the assistant administrators, the staff level positions. And I think that putting the agency back on track was very much what Bill did. He put a committed team of professionals in place, committed to the mission of EPA, and quickly opened communication with members of Congress, with the various constituent groups, whether they be environmental or business, that the agency had so much impact on. Opened up communication with the state agencies that we dealt with. And I think got about the business of EPA, and probably more than anything else, that's what restored the morale of the employees of the agency. We got about our business.
We had, I think, 7,000 or 8,000 people when we started, and authorization to hire 2,000 more to fill out the responsibilities that were loaded on the agency. And fortunately, I had some very good help, some people who did understand the intricacies of government management and how it should work. And I was at least wise enough to rely on their advice to help move the whole thing forward.
Well, probably the most important thing that I wanted to get done that would have the broadest, I mean, there were a lot of issues. There was NSR, there were a whole host of issues and things that I dealt with as a governor that were ripe for decision making here. But probably the biggest was trying to change the mindset that people on the extremes have about the environment, which is what we were talking about earlier, that you can't have a healthy economy and the clean and green environment. And in fact, you can and you must. There's not an economy anywhere in the world that's thriving if your air isn't clean and if your water isn't pure, if people can't get good drinking water, if they don't have a good quality of life. And the environment very much needs the healthy economy because we need the money to invest in new technology to improve what we're doing and improve the way we clean our atmosphere and the way we handle Earth, and money to be able to buy land to set it aside. And so that was probably the big, changing that mindset, getting people to think in a different way. And we really did that through the creation of the report card on the status of the environment, which we started almost immediately after I came into office. And it took about two 2 years. Eileen McGinnis was spearheading that for me as Chief of Staff, and we finally got it done. It had been, again, something that the National Academies had called for early on in the history of the agency. You know, how can you know whether you're making progress if you don't know where you are? And we had bits and pieces of it, but it had never been brought together in one place. And so we worked very hard on that, and I believe that report card was one of the best works that this agency has put out.
Well, as far as the agency is concerned, when I first went over there, the thing that needed attention was the Superfund program. I mean, we needed to get that program moving forward consistent with the overall statutory direction that we had been given. It was bogged down, really hadn't gotten off the ground fully. There was a lot of controversy as far as Congress is concerned as to how we were going forward with it. And so the thing that needed attention immediately in the agency was the Superfund program. And getting it organized, getting it moving, getting policies, procedures, action underway, and interacting with Congress on how we were doing that was the thing I worked on for the first year.
The thing that was the biggest challenge was that there were such great expectations among many who affect our lives on the Hill that we would kind of step back and not be pursuing any kind of new initiatives and not trying to ensure that the agency continued to enforce regulations, that they got very upset when we did, and it made life more challenging perhaps than it needed to be.
Yeah, there was rivers catching on fire. People in Denver wanted to see the mountains, and in Los Angeles they wanted to see one another. I mean, there were all kinds of problems that were, as I say, smell, touch, and feel. People going to work every morning could see those problems. We've forgotten how much progress we've made against that original agenda on the environment, and how much better the environment is today than it was back in 1970 when all this started. And I think the reason it's important to remember that is that some of these problems, new problems crop up all the time that look insoluble today, really are capable of being solved with the right kind of determination and wise policy judgments.
Well, there were any number of things. I mean, we were involved in reauthorizing the Clean Water Act, and so we had a whole series of issues there that we were dealing with. When I was administrator, I was very involved in air issues. I signed the regulations to phase lead out of gasoline. We worked on the air toxics issue that eventually became a part of the reauthorized Clean Air Act. There was a small issue that turned into probably one of the biggest issues I worked on, which was ozone depletion, stratospheric ozone depletion.
I wanted to be able to say when I left the agency that the air was cleaner, the water pure, and the land better protected, people living healthier lives than when we came in, because that's what we're all about. We're not about the number of regulations that have been promulgated, the number of new laws that have come into being, the number of fines, fees, and penalties we've collected. We're about have we improved the environment and public health. Those others are just tools, are means to an end. And they're important tools, and we need to use them, but unless we can validate what we're doing through those by measured improvement in the environment, we need to stop, take a step back and another look at it and say, okay, how do we do this better?
I have never thought of myself so much as a crusader but somebody who really believes that public service is a very high calling. And your responsibility as a public servant is to try to divine what's in the public interest, and then whatever responsibility you're assigned, make sure that it's directed accordingly. And if you keep reminding yourself you're a public servant and you're here to serve the public and to make sure that their interests are represented in your decisions, I don't think you'll go that far wrong.